Here we are again, some of us at least again, to shine a light on domestic violence. It's not the first or only time we've been presented the matter of domestic violence at a gathering, nor do we expect it to be the last time it's addressed, though we wish that were true. The statistics are alarming, with domestic violence occurring across all socioeconomic classes. Depending on the type of violence, it might be 1 in 7, 1 in 5, or even 1 in 3 women who have experienced such. It is very likely that some of you at this meeting have experienced domestic violence or know someone who has. Well, it is God's dream that we address domestic violence until it doesn't happen again, and bring healing to those it has touched until that day. I am Martha Poole, moderator of Presbyterian Women in the Presbytery of Scioto Valley, and I welcome each of you to our Zoom gathering today. And now I will turn the screen over to Susan Emmel.
Good morning, and it's great to see all of you. Thank you for joining us. The theme of today's gathering was determined by the input we got on last year's evaluation about topics that people wanted to hear more about. So you'll have a chance at the end of the meeting to complete this year's evaluation, and there are topics that you can rate, and that helps the gathering planning team to decide what they're going to do. So I am fortunate to have had a good planning group, and we put this together not overnight, but we put it together with lots of help. And finding the Ohio Domestic Violence Network was great, because if you haven't been on their website, you will see that they have a lot of information. So one of my tasks is to try to keep us on schedule. So we're going to start with Kathy Bubb doing devotions. Probably many of you know Kathy. She's been the moderator or the chair of the Presbytery's Commission on Nurture and Outreach for a number of years, and they've planned PIE, and she's a member of Mifflin Presbyterian Church. When I asked her for her bio, that was what she said. So Kathy is going to start us off with devotions related to Matthew 25.
Thank you, Susan. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here today. As Susan said, I'm former chair of the Commission on Nurture and Outreach. I'm also part of the task team for Matthew 25 in our presbytery. As most of you are aware, Matthew 25 is a movement within the Presbyterian Church USA to live out those words from Scripture that are pretty much in our DNA at this point. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. In the PCUSA, the Matthew 25 initiative highlights 3 areas for our churches: dismantling structural racism, eradicating systemic poverty, and building congregational vitality. Now, they have recently identified 3 what they call intersectional priorities, and this is that understanding that so many of our issues overlap with issues of racism and poverty. Those are climate change, militarism, and gender issues. You may know for Matthew 25 that we have 16 churches in our presbytery that are Matthew 25 churches. I understand there's another who's voting on Monday at their session meeting to perhaps become a Matthew 25 church. Our presbytery is a Matthew 25 presbytery. And of course, Presbyterian women have been a leader in these efforts in our churches. our presbytery, our country, even around the world. And I know you should be very proud of that. So as I learned about the theme of domestic violence for this winter's Presbyterian Women's Gathering, I reflected on the connection to Matthew 25 initiative. And in some ways, it doesn't seem to fit quite as well. Domestic violence certainly transcends issues of race, transcends issues of poverty. And certainly many congregations don't see their involvement in domestic violence as part of what builds their vitality. Yet these words from Matthew 25 speak to the crucial role of our presence with all of those in need. We must indeed become part of God's dream for health and wholeness for all people. I want to share with you some reflections written by Dawn Walker, who's the founder and director of Single Parish Missions in Paris, Kentucky. And she starts out her reflection, as I will share with ours, from Psalm 72, verses 12 to 14. God will rescue the poor when they cry out. God will help the oppressed who have no one to defend them. God feels pity for the weak and the needy and will rescue them. God will redeem them from oppression and violence, for their lives are precious to God. And here are some of her reflections about domestic violence in Matthew 25. One great big evil that needs to be confronted by the church today is domestic violence. Why is domestic violence such a threat to the body of Christ? Because it's an enemy we have given untold power to by keeping it hidden. We don't talk about it with our teens. We don't talk about it in premarital counseling. And we certainly don't talk about it on Sunday mornings. National campaigns to end domestic violence tout the phrase, break the silence. Yet the place where the silence often gets most strongly upheld is in the church. Maybe we avoid the topic of domestic violence because if it's happening within a marriage, we consider it off-limits territory. Maybe we shy away because we are uneducated or don't have any personal experience dealing with it. Or maybe because confronting it makes us too uncomfortable and calls out of us a relational discernment and spiritual authority we're not sure we have. Whatever the reason, our silence is costly. It is an evil that pervades all ages, ethnicities, and religious denominations. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women, more than car accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. 75% of all 911 calls are domestic violence related. God was never silent on the issue of violence, yet generations of women have given up on God because the church, either through its silence or its misinterpretation of Scripture, has told them that God does not care about the abuse and cruelty they suffer. Somewhere along the line, these women were convinced to grimly stick it out in marriages where they were emotionally, verbally, and physically abused, at the expense of letting their hearts die and shutting out the possibility of a God who lavishly loves them. Most domestic violence victims don't consider the church as a relevant place to go for help, because when they tried asking for help in the past, the response they got was weak or passive at best. Sure, it's human nature to want to avoid potentially explosive situations, but we can't avoid the fact that Jesus never backed down from them. He didn't back down from uncomfortable conversations or violent people, and always offered strong protection to women being mistreated or needing refuge. With his Father's love and authority, Jesus stepped right in the middle of hostile situations time and time again. He stepped in to confront, and he stepped in to protect. And with his Spirit, he gives us the love and authority we need to do the same. The bottom line is, God is love, and love always protects. As God ambassadors here on the earth, we are also called to protect the weak. I was very moved and challenged by Dawn's words, as well as by God's call to always protect the weak. I think of times in my life when I did not want to see the verbal emotional, or even physical abuse around me. I think of my friend Mary, a woman from New Zealand, a teacher, a dog lover, a woman of faith who took very seriously her call to serve those in need. Mary also took very seriously her wedding vows, and no amount of persuasion could convince her that she should no longer stay with a man who regularly berated her, threatened her, and made her feel like everything she ever did was wrong and her fault. I invite you to close your eyes and picture a woman in your life who is or has been a victim of domestic violence. Don't think you know anyone? Well, picture that woman in your congregation whom you don't know very well, who is very quiet and keeps to herself. Perhaps it is her. Picture that woman in your neighborhood who doesn't interact with the other neighbors, who seems to shy away from interaction. Perhaps it is her. Picture the receptionist at the doctor's office, the nurse, the doctor herself, with unexplained bruises. Perhaps it is her. Hold these women up in the light of God's love. And as a church, we can do better, and we should do better. We need to speak to truth about domestic violence, to bring the evil of domestic violence out into the light, confronting it openly and taking decisive action against it. We need to let victims know that we will come alongside them, that they will be loved and protected, and that God will not abandon them, for their lives are precious to God. And that's really what Matthew 25 is all about, is being reminded that we as a church are called to protect, to support, to confront, to take action against all those things that are not part of God's dream for our world today. Will you join me for prayer? Empower us, O God, to work with you, to rescue the poor when they cry out, to help the oppressed who have no one to defend them. Help us to see with your eyes and feel pity for the weak and the needy and rescue them. Strengthen us as we seek to redeem them from oppression and violence, for their lives are indeed precious to you. Amen.
Thank you, Kathy, for what a powerful introduction to our day. So now we're going to turn to the rest of the program, and I'd like to introduce Leah Stone, who's the Assistant Director of Training at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. And I want to say just a bit about the Gathering offering. You are, of course, welcome to send money to Bonnie Beth Mitchell, our treasurer, but we are also encouraging you to think about helping or making a donation to your local domestic violence shelter. And the Ohio Domestic Violence Network has a map that shows where the shelters are located if you don't know where one is in your area. And usually when you locate the shelter, you can go on to their website and find out what things they need besides money. They may need supplies or something. So if you need help with this, you can send me an email and I will help you figure out where your domestic violence shelter is. So Leah, who's going to talk with us about domestic violence, her bio is at the end of the agenda, and I'm just going to say one thing that's not in that. I found out from one of her colleagues that she's been attending a Presbyterian church, the Corinth Did I say that right, Leah? The Corinth Presbyterian Church in Dayton. And last Sunday, she gave a presentation at their service on survivors. So we're not only do we have a speaker who's knowledgeable, she's also one of us, a Presbyterian woman. So Leah, if you have questions for Leah, you can put them in the chat.
Thank you so much for that introduction, both by Susan as well as by Kathy and everybody who's already spoken here this morning. I have to say that when I said earlier that I hopped on here for early just to make sure my tech was working, I was only partially telling the full story. The other part of the story is really that you all are my people. And I had that affirmed just listening to the conversations this morning before you got started, listening to that connection to Matthew 25. I feel really grateful to be here today. And as was mentioned, it's just funny how things fall into line. I did this very, very similar presentation in my own new church last weekend. So I've been attending Corinth for the last 6 months. I'm very new, but again, feel like I found my people. So just want to say thank you all so much for inviting me here today. My name is Leah, as has already been said, but I started working in this field in early 2013, doing internship work to start, but then have grown in this work and moved into working at the statewide level over the last 10 years that I've been doing this work. And I can say that there's not enough gratitude I can express for the ability for you all to sit and really hear this message and to hear the reality of domestic violence, because I know that this is a really hard conversation. I've done this work long enough to know that not only, is it hard to every day, in my work, interact with and see the impacts of violence on an everyday kind of basis. I know that when you're not constantly confronted with it, though, sometimes it can feel even harder to recognize the reality. So I want to acknowledge the fact that this is an uncomfortable conversation and ask a couple of things in response to that. First is that I want to encourage you all to take care of yourselves. If you especially have had a personal experience with domestic violence, if you know somebody close to you who has, some of these things can be hard and triggering to hear at times. So I don't want anybody to feel as though they need to sit in a space that is emotionally overwhelming. You can get up, you can get a glass of water, you can do whatever you need to do to take care of you today. But I'm also going to ask that if you don't have that personal history of domestic violence, or maybe if your discomfort is coming from another place, because in all reality, this is an uncomfortable conversation. I want to encourage you to do something, which is to welcome and maybe even sit with that discomfort for a moment. Because in all reality, I don't think talking about domestic violence should ever feel comfortable. I think we're meant to feel uncomfortable about it because we're meant to do something about it. We are meant for that discomfort to drive action. So all that to say, again, I love how Kathy got us started off, because I often call domestic violence the silenced epidemic. An epidemic because it's happening so frequently in our world, oftentimes without us even knowing it. But specifically, I like to call it a silenced epidemic because in all the time that I've worked in domestic violence, I have never known domestic violence itself to be quiet. It happens loudly, often intrusively. It impacts all areas of a person's life. But oftentimes the reasons why we don't hear about it is not because it in and of itself is quiet, but because it is silenced, both by the person who's perpetrating the abuse, but also unfortunately by the people around the survivor. And that's the really hard reality to sit with, is that we live in a society that often does tend to silence survivors and victims. So one of the reasons why I tend to say that it is silenced besides just by the fear that a batterer will invoke in a relationship. It's also silence because we have these myths and misconceptions about domestic violence. And those myths and misconceptions come from a lot of different places. They come from our society, they come from the families we were raised in. So we're just going to do something to get us started. We're going to call them out. We're going to call out what are the myths that most of us at some point in our life have heard about domestic violence, and that you might notice that you still have. There's no shame or judgment in this conversation. I have held at some point each one of these myths and misconceptions about domestic violence myself. So we just want to sit and acknowledge them to help shed light on some of those stories that cause silence. So one of the first ones, and you may have heard this maybe when you all were talking about having this conversation, or maybe if you were sharing with somebody, hey, this is what my Saturday morning is going to look like. Fun Saturday morning, right? Although I am glad that you all are here. You may have heard this before. It doesn't happen here, not in our church, not in our community. And if you're here today, I have to hope a little bit that you realize that at least some part of this is not true. Because statistically, as we'll talk about and has already been mentioned, statistically, it's not likely that it's not happening in the areas that you live your life in. But a lot of the times people think this because of this second misconception, which is it doesn't really impact me or anybody I know. And I often say that you might not know a domestic violence, or I should actually change that. You might not know that you know a domestic violence survivor, but I guarantee you do. That whether or not you know that you know somebody, you probably know somebody. And we'll talk a little bit more about that misconception later. But there's also some misconceptions around what causes domestic violence that I want to help bring some light and some truth around. One of them is that domestic violence is caused by somebody who's really angry or really jealous, or these big emotions that get suppressed and shoved down. And that's not to say that these aren't a part of domestic violence, because they definitely are. But what we're going to talk about is that there's actually something a little more insidious at the heart of domestic violence. Another misconception is that domestic violence is caused by substance use or by mental illness. And again, these are really common and also very dangerous aspects that when they're a part of domestic violence, they increase the risk that somebody is probably going to be hurt worse. But these also, mental illness and addiction, are also not the root of domestic violence. Again, we'll talk about what causes domestic violence here in a moment, but these are really common misconceptions that they're caused by addiction, that it's caused by anger, that it's caused by mental illness. And unfortunately, it really is more complicated and deeper than that. And this last one, she needs to just leave or this wouldn't be happening. This is a hard one, so I'm going to pause because I want to let this set in for a moment. That oftentimes we ask, or our society asks this question or makes this statement where we are placing blame on the person experiencing the harm, but not asking the question or making the statement, why is he doing that? Or maybe an even more uncomfortable question is, what am I doing to help? Because sometimes we realize when we ask that question, we could be doing more. But to shift the discomfort, our society has created a narrative. It's her fault. She's the reason. She just needs to leave. So looking at all of these, again, I know it can be uncomfortable to call them out and sit with them, but it's so important that the first thing that we do is acknowledge what are the unconscious beliefs that we've been told to believe so that we can start to unravel them. And we're going to unravel these hopefully by the end of our time together, our talking. All of these not just feel untrue, but you have information that helps you know that these are in fact untrue. And we're going to start with the first one, right? The statistics around it doesn't happen here, or I don't know anybody. Well, in all reality, domestic violence is something that is happening to far too many people. It would be far too many people if it was one person, but unfortunately, it is not one person. It is not 100 people. it is more than 1 in 3 women experiencing violence, whether that be physical or sexual violence or stalking, by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 1 in 3. And nationwide, there ends up being an average of 3 women killed every single day by a current or former intimate partner. So not only is this epidemic happening at huge, massive levels, it's regularly taking lives. And in fact, in the last year, the Ohio Domestic Violence Network recorded in Ohio that there were 112 fatalities between July of 2021 and June of 2022. Now, that in and of itself is a hard number to swallow. 122 recorded fatalities, 22 of which were children. It's a hard thing to acknowledge. In fact, in the last year, we recorded the most deaths of children from domestic violence in the state of Ohio. But in all reality, this number is just a fraction of what actually this is meant to represent, because we say 112 recorded fatalities, and it's only those recorded because we don't know all of the deaths because of domestic violence in Ohio. This is only a fraction of what we know. So if you're looking at 112 and thinking, oh my gosh, that is more than one person in the last year for every single county in the state of Ohio, on average, experienced more than one loss of a life because of domestic violence. It is more than that, but this is what we know. And then also nearly 26% of children are exposed to domestic violence in our lifetime. And we tend to think about domestic violence as something that happens to adult women, but we'll see on this next slide how domestic violence impacts everyone. And I do see some questions in the chat that I am happy to address and come to in just a moment, but I want to share one more statistic that isn't on this slide. And that is that, that second bullet point of domestic violence doesn't impact me because I don't know anybody. You might not know somebody or know that you know somebody. You might not be a victim or survivor of domestic violence yourself. However, domestic violence impacts all of us, because another issue that I know is on all of our minds, and actually having now been a part of a Presbyterian church for the last 6 months, I know is also an issue that the Presbyterian Church USA cares deeply about, is gun violence. And statistically, 50%, slightly over 50% of all mass shootings are linked to domestic violence at their core. So in reality, this is an issue that does not stay behind closed doors, even if it starts there. It comes into our communities and causes more damage to even those who are not the direct victims. And I see Karen asking, do the statistics include emotional abuse? Yes, Karen, and we don't even, what's hard about the statistics is they don't even reflect the whole picture, right? We don't even, I think, have accurate statistics of how many people experience emotional abuse, because that is a form of abuse that can be a lot harder for people to identify. And we'll talk about all the different kinds and types and tactics of abuse here in a little bit later, but those statistics really specifically capture physical and sexual violence and stalking. But I like to think of it as kind of like a canary in a coal mine. If one of those things is happening, I guarantee you emotional abuse and mental coercion manipulation is also a part of the equation. And I also just want to uplift someone sharing their own experience of experiencing domestic violence, their own domestic violence lived experience. And I'm glad that you're here. I am so sorry to know that that happened to you, and also so appreciative of you spending the time this morning you already have a lived experience, so you know that this is a reality, and we're glad to have you here for that. So what does it look like when we talk about these statistics? Those are just numbers on a screen, or they can feel like numbers on a screen, right? Now, if you all were in front of me right now, this is what I did in my church last weekend. I literally had people count off and they stood up, but because virtually together, not physically together, I just want to get help you all get a visual of what that looks like. So do you know 3 women? Well, there's enough of us on this call to where I know that you do. Again, more than 1 in 3 women experience some form of violence or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. This is what the experience of children witnessing domestic violence looks like. Children tend to be left out of the conversation often, unfortunately. Again, we tend to think of the adult women, but 1 in 4 children, more than 1 in 4 children, really, if it's 26%. And another statistic that I just want to bring to light and acknowledge, because we also don't talk about this often, but 1 in 7 men also report experiencing some form of violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. And I do think it's important to acknowledge, while women are the vast majority of domestic violence victims, and men do represent the vast majority of offenders, men also, this is not simply an issue that our society can say, well, that's a women's issue. This isn't just a women's issue. And even if women were the only victims and men were the only offenders, this still makes this a human issue if men are the one committing the violence the vast majority of the time, but we also know that men can be victims as well. So I want to talk a little bit about what is domestic violence, helping us to understand a little bit more when we're talking about this experience, what does this all encapture? So what we're going to talk about is the social definition. And I say social definition because this is actually a little different from the legal definition. The legal definition is what the Ohio law says. This is the crime of domestic violence, and this is what you can be arrested for. And it's actually slightly different from the social definition. We talk about the social definition here because it's a little bit more expansive. But just know that there's also a legal definition as well, because domestic violence is a crime, but it might not include all the things that we talk about in this definition. So first and foremost, I want to acknowledge that domestic violence happens across the spectrum of time, of behaviors, of relationships. It doesn't just look like one thing. And across that spectrum of behaviors and times and relationships is a pattern of coercive and controlling behaviors. So domestic violence isn't just a one-time event. It's typically something that starts off in one place and escalates in both the frequency and the severity over time. So it's a pattern that tends to happen more frequently and worse. It also includes physical, sexual, and psychological attacks, as well as economic coercion. Although, as we'll talk about here in just a moment, those aren't the only kinds of abuse that domestic violence survivors experience. Those are just examples. And then lastly, that adults and adolescents can use against their intimate partners. February is actually Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. And so when we talk about teen dating violence awareness, thinking the experience of young women or young teens who are experiencing this pattern and this cycle of abuse early, it's very important that we acknowledge and recognize our youth also are experiencing the epidemic of intimate partner violence as well. I want to pause to also acknowledge that domestic violence can happen within households between parents and children. Again, children tend to be left out of the conversations, but we want to acknowledge that they are also experiencing violence at epidemic rates. And so I want to show this visual. This might look like a lot for people. This is, and we're going to break this down what this visual looks like, but I like to use this visual for a couple reasons. One, because it is a visual that we use a lot in the domestic violence field. It was created in the late 1980s. And in the late 1980s, this was developed as a way to really encapsulate and visualize what we're talking about when we're talking about domestic violence. I also like to use this visual because it helps us understand what really causes domestic violence, what the root cause of it is. So I want for you to look at this visual. I hope everybody can see it, whether you're on a phone or a laptop, but I'm going to also explain it as well. On the outer ring, you see this big, dark, bolded line that says violence, physical and sexual. So think of this like a bicycle wheel. You have a bicycle wheel, and on the outside is like the rubber outside where the, literally where the rubber is meeting the road of the bicycle and the pavement. Think of this outer line as like the rubber piece. It's the part that if it gets deflated, it's going to be really hard for that bike to go anywhere, right? Maybe not impossible. You could probably still push the bike for a little bit longer, but this really keeps the wheel moving forward. It also helps provide structure to the bicycle wheel. And what we know about domestic violence is that the physical and sexual violence is that external structure. It's the thing that people tend to see the most. When we think of domestic violence, we think of the black eyes and the bruises, but it's also the thing that creates a sense of structure within the abusive relationship that can make it really hard to leave. And now we also are going to move to the inner part, what I think looks like the spokes of the wheel. And the spokes of the wheel create an internal structure to where if you didn't have the spokes of the wheel, this wheel probably wouldn't even exist. The rubber wouldn't be able to hold up, and certainly it wouldn't connect to the internal part. And that's a lot how each of these tactics exists. Somebody mentioned, do we have statistics for emotional abuse? But you see within this wheel how emotional abuse is used often in tandem with physical and sexual violence to create a structure of an abusive relationship. These are all the tactics that people might not see when they look at or externally are looking into a relationship that could be abusive, but it's the parts that create a structure that people don't often see. So using emotional abuse, using intimidation, using coercion and threats, isolation, minimizing and denying and blaming, also known as mental abuse or gaslighting, using children, economic abuse. And then this last one right here that I'm just going to pause on for a moment, using male privilege. And this one can be a hard one for a lot of people to fully understand what that means, but I want to break it down for a moment because it's an important one. Using male privilege can look like, I'm the head of this household. You listen to me. It can look like, I wear the pants in this family, or you are to be subservient to me. And unfortunately, what I have noticed working in this field is that oftentimes, especially in relationships between a man and a woman, and when they have a shared faith of Christianity, sometimes Bible verses are manipulated and twisted and used against a victim to say, you must listen to me. This is what your belief says. And I use those words manipulate, coerce, twisted, both because of the fact that I come from the Christian faith and have a baseline understanding of the foundation behind some of those verses being different from how abusive partners tend to use them, but also because of the fact that we know that healthy relationships aren't built upon somebody forcing their will, their desires, a power over another person. And that's where we get to this inner piece right here. What is really at the root of domestic violence and violent relationships is power and control. When one person has more power and control or creates an unequal power and control dynamic within the relationship. So what we see in unhealthy relationships, not necessarily abusive, but unhealthy relationships, is that there's a struggle back and forth between power and control. Each person is trying to gain or maintain power and control. We could see that in unhealthy relationship dynamics. In healthy relationships, we see that two people are making decisions together, that they respect and value each other equally, as equals. You might have one partner who says, hey, if you take control over the dishes, I'll take control over cleaning up the backyard. So you might see that one person has more domain over certain areas. That doesn't make an unhealthy relationship. What makes an unhealthy relationship is when violence, coercion, degradation, and disrespect make up the fuel that moves forward how another person makes decisions. So making threats of, you must do this, I say to do this, or else, implied threats, or sometimes very overt and explicit threats. and of course, violence. And when we recognize power and control is really at the heart of what makes up and fuels an abusive relationship, it helps us understand a little bit better that final myth and the answer to that question, which is why do they stay or why don't they just leave? Again, this is a hard one to talk about and to acknowledge, but we are going to answer it. We are going to talk about it. Not because I really think it's a super valid question, because it puts, again, a lot of onus on victims, but because there are really good reasons why people tend to stay and stay for as long as they do. And one of the very first ones, and one of the most common ones, is just money, resources. 94 to 99% of domestic violence victims are experiencing some form of financial abuse. So having money controlled, not having control over their own money, being forced to not work, credit, what's the word, damaging credit, damaging somebody's credit or stealing their identity. These are all very common forms of abuse that sometimes domestic violence survivors don't even know are happening because it's happening behind the scenes. Also, this is one that I can be hard for people who don't, again, fully understand domestic violence to really fully understand, and it is the fear of further harm. Oftentimes, domestic violence survivors stay in an abusive relationship because it feels safer to them, not just emotionally, but physically. And so a lot of people ask or say, we'll just be safer if you left. And that's the hope, right? That's the desire. It'll be safer if somebody leaves. But the reality is that when somebody is leaving an abusive relationship, think about the time from when they decide, I'm going to leave. They start making steps to plan, start gathering items, making phone calls, and then they actually leave. It is the most dangerous point within the context of that abusive relationship. And we call this what's called a fatality factor, or I'm sorry, a lethality factor. A lethality factor is saying that it's a factor that increases the risk that somebody will die as a result of domestic violence. And separation is a lethality factor because for that period of time that they're leaving, the abusive partner has lost control or they're losing control. So often they use escalated tactics to try to get it back. And children, I watched, oh gosh, I don't even know how many years ago. I watched a Dr. Phil episode. It's the last time I ever watched Dr. Phil, by the way, where he berated this woman on stage saying, why won't you leave for your children? I can understand you may be staying for you, but there's children involved. Trying to guilt and shame this woman into saying you're putting your children at risk. But in reality, domestic violence survivors are often, I'm going to change that, always thinking about their safety and certainly their children's safety in the midst of that. Because in all reality, domestic violence survivors aren't often the only ones in the home experiencing the violence. They're worried that their kids will as well. And if they leave, even if they take their children, the legal system very rarely terminates full parental rights of one parent. So the reality that those children will have to go back to that home, but then without the mother present to protect them, is a very, very real reality. And so women will often stay to protect their children, to be the buffer. And also pets. 50% or 1 in 2 of domestic violence survivors say that they wouldn't leave an abusive relationship if they couldn't take their pet with them. And most domestic violence shelters don't have a pet program. So people stay because they want to make sure the people that they love and the pets that they love are safe. Speaking of domestic violence shelters, Ohio Domestic Violence Network did a study in the last year in which they found that 1 out of every 5 domestic violence survivors who called a hotline seeking emergency shelter were turned away that day. So 20% of people who called an emergency hotline had the bravery and the courage in that moment to say, I'm going to call somebody and I need to get out. 20% of those people were told, we're so sorry, we don't have room for you right now. And so in all reality, leaving is not so simple when you don't have a place to go. And this one's a hard one. again. It was already mentioned before by Kathy. I'm going to reiterate it here. Religion, whether it be a person's own religious beliefs or their religious community telling them to stay. Unfortunately, religion and spirituality, instead of being a support, as it should be, is oftentimes a barrier to leave. And the legal system is not an easy one to navigate. Often survivors don't have the financial resources to be able to hire an attorney for somebody to help them navigate it. And the legal system, again, often does not create an environment in which it feels safe for a survivor to leave, whether that be through the custody battles or through the divorce process, or even through seeking a protection order. Most survivors report that it's not necessarily a part of their safety plan to seek legal help. And then lastly, love. And I hope we can all relate to this one, even if it's a hard one to recognize, can still be present in a violent relationship. That relationship didn't start out where it is now. And we build as human beings bonds and attachments and connections with people that are not easily broken, and frankly, are not easily broken on purpose. Our hearts and our brains are wired this way. So yes, sometimes love. So as we close up, as I wrap up some of my final thoughts, I want us to help make this shift. I hope that what we talk about here helps make a shift between what is wrong with this person, what is wrong with you, why won't you make this decision to leave, to what has happened to you. And this is what we call a trauma-informed response, taking the thought process of what's wrong with you, why did you stay, to what has happened to you, and more importantly, how can I help you? So I want to start by saying that the one way to start being trauma informed is to recognize that trauma is happening. So there is no one way for an abusive relationship to look, but here are some signs to look out for in relationships. And I'm just going to go through these kind of quickly because you can see them on the screen, but also just know this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a pretty accurate and extensive list of what you might notice. So a person is maybe starting to isolate from people around them. They're not interacting with people the same way they used to, or maybe if they're new, they're not interacting with people at all. They might often cancel plans at the last minute, which can be really frustrating. If you've ever been on the receiving end of canceled plans, it can feel really, really annoying, but it might also be a cue for us to ask more questions. They might get frequent calls from their partner or have their partner check in with them frequently, responding to text urgently because they don't want to make their partner mad. And on the flip side of that, maybe this person also expresses fear at the idea of their partner being mad at them. I know I don't like it when my partner is mad at me. I'm not a huge fan of my partner being angry with me, but I'm never in fear if he's angry with me. I'm never in crisis at the idea of him being frustrated with me. But in a domestic violence relationship, she might be overly placating to a partner, wanting to make sure that he is not mad at her. They might casually mention that abuse is happening, but then brush it off and say, oh, it's not that big of a deal, because they don't want people to see their partner as a bad person. Or they might have unexplained injuries or offer explanations that just don't make sense for those injuries. So then, this begs the question, what can I do, right? We're ending on an up note because the reality is that domestic violence is both something that we can respond to and also something that I truly deeply believe with all of my heart we can end, or else I wouldn't be doing this work. So we can start simply just by believing survivors, by believing their experiences, and by believing that they are the experts on their lives and that they know what it is that they need, even if they don't know exactly what that looks like. We just start by believing and listening non-judgmentally, knowing that what decisions that they make based on the information that you give them are going to be the best decisions that they can make for themselves in that moment. They might not be the same decisions you would make, but we are there to listen. We can also just stay close and offer support, and our inclination might be, ooh, back away. This feels dangerous to me. And we want to make sure that we're safe. We don't want to put ourselves in unsafe situations. But oftentimes an abusive partner will try to isolate people from around them so that, they don't have a support system. So we want to try to stay close and share information and resources. On my last slide here, I'm going to share the website that you can go to see your local domestic violence resource. But I just want to end by saying a couple of common things that we maybe shouldn't do. We don't want to try to force or push to leave because they might not A, be emotionally ready, or B, be physically ready and safe enough to leave yet. They might need more resources. We do not want to make decisions for them. So calling law enforcement or calling police, unless there's actively abuse happening in front of you or over the phone, you hear it happening, unless that's the case, we actually don't want to make those decisions for them before they're ready because it can actually make their situation more unsafe. We don't want to offer couples counseling or anger management. And here's why. There's been a lot of research and studies to show that when domestic violence is actively happening, couples counseling is actually more damaging. It actually creates a more ingrained cycle of power and control. And it can cause the survivor to think that they can't seek help or can't seek counseling if they have a bad experience in couples counseling. And anger management, we already talked about. Anger is not at the root of domestic violence, it's power and control. So anger management is actually not the resource that we want to give somebody. We could talk about domestic violence programs. We can talk about domestic violence intervention classes, but couples counseling and anger management are just not it. And again, we don't want to criticize. We don't want to judge. We just want to listen. All right, so I've come to the end. I think I'm a couple minutes over. My apologies. So I'm going to hand it back by ending and saying there is help. There are resources available where you don't have to feel like you're the expert in everything. There are experts out there available and ready to help. So I put this in the chat earlier, but I'm going to put it in the chat again. odvn.org/find-help is where you can go to find your local domestic violence program. If you type in your zip code, you can also go there to find resources for somebody else. And here is our last page, our website that you can visit. And I'm actually just going to put my email in the chat as well. Please know that you can reach out to me whenever you need. That I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation and not the end, although I know that it won't be the end because I've been here since the beginning of this conversation for you all. So I know that you're going to keep having this conversation. I cannot thank you enough. I'm probably one of the only people who feels like I can talk about domestic violence all day long, but I will spare you all that because I know we're getting ready to go into conversation about it. So I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be here. And I hope that there's at least one thing that you took away from today that feels like it's going to better help you in supporting survivors.
Introducing you, Erin. Erin Blaymeyer is a peer advocate for Sanctuary Night and a survivor of domestic violence, drug addiction, and human trafficking. Currently, Erin is completing her Microsoft Office Specialist Master Certification at Columbus State with plans to pursue her associate's degree in social work. Thank you, Erin, for joining us today.
Hello, ladies. My name is Erin Blaymeyer, and it's an honor to be here sharing my experience as a survivor of domestic violence. I believe if we as a society get more comfortable speaking openly about these unpleasant topics, we will be better equipped to handle them in our own lives and in the lives of those we encounter day to day. I was raised in a middle-class, two-parent home in Northeast Ohio, and I wasn't exposed to any of the adverse childhood experiences. I still never felt good enough. I never quite knew who I was or where I belonged. In high school, I remember having a lesson on intimate partner violence in a home ec class, and I dismissed the teaching thinking that it could never happen to me. Well, it did, time and time again. I wasn't quite 18 the first time a boyfriend called me a name and grabbed a hold of my arm hard enough to leave bruises the next day. The stereotypical flowers and mushy apologies followed right behind it. As the story goes, all the kind sentiments were quickly forgotten the next time I laughed at a joke or put my lipstick on a little too bright. I had become so wrapped up in this boy that I had let him isolate me from anyone that cared enough to notice. Hold on, apologize. Okay, I had let him isolate me from anyone who cared enough to notice. Truth be told, I probably wouldn't have listened to anyone anyways, because by at that point, I believed the lie. I believed it was my fault that I made him do it. Once I even heard, you know how a parent punishes their children for doing something they shouldn't, and it's because they love them? That's what I have to do to you, Aaron. If I didn't love you so much, I wouldn't do it. Even after leaving this relationship, the pattern never changed, only reinforcing the belief that I was the one to blame. After all, I was the common denominator. It wasn't until decades later that I learned that abusers seek out women that are vulnerable and manipulate the situation in order to gain power and control. All the times that I believed that I must like being treated that way, or I was only attracted to bad boys, the truth was that these men were drawn to me. It wasn't until I gained knowledge and information and the support of others like me that I was able to break that cycle. Now, currently, I work as a certified peer recovery supporter alongside our community's most vulnerable women, and my experiences, which once made me incapable of success, are what today enable my success and help me empower other women to make healthy choices and break their own cycles. Okay, that was a lot, took me a lot less time than I thought it was going to read it. So I will go into a little bit more detail. I found in my life that once I got accustomed to being treated one way, I felt like that was what I deserved. And I didn't deserve any better, because if I deserved any better, I would receive better, right? And so I just kept, in my mind, choosing the same type of men. But after the education I received, I learned like that wasn't the case. I just became more susceptible to those types of men because they saw something in me that they were attracted to because of their own faults. And no matter how many times somebody told me like, oh, Aaron, you don't have to live like this. Oh, it's not your fault. I didn't believe it. It was, eventually I'd had enough. Eventually I got to the point where I was tired of hurting. I was tired. And that's when like I kind of swore off relationships. I was like, oh, well, I'm the bad one. Like, clearly I don't deserve to be loved the right way. Like, I knew the way I was being loved wasn't love, and that's not what it was supposed to be, but I still felt like I didn't deserve any better. So I was just kind of like resigned to, oh, well, maybe it's meant for some people, but it's not meant for me. But it was at that point when like my healing began. And once the healing started and I worked on what was broken in me, did I gain the strength to like advocate for myself, stand up for myself, and teach people how it was okay to treat me. And I don't care. I had mentioned in the breakout room, like my soon-to-be 13-year-old son witnessed his father and other boyfriends put their hands on me, talk to me any kind of way, disrespect me, and I allowed it. And so he therefore thinks it's okay. And there's no amount of telling him now, like, oh, I'm your mother, you have to respect me, because he's never seen me make anybody respect me. And so he doesn't feel he has to respect me. But at the point I'm at today, like, you can be my child, you can be the mailman, I don't care who you are, you're going to speak to me with respect and treat me with respect, or you're not going to be in my life. And something I think that is necessary as women, as a society, is we teach our young children how to be spoke to, how they deserve to be treated, and constantly affirm them that they're worth it, they deserve it, that they don't deserve to be hurt or be mean to, and build up every bit of self-confidence in them possible. Because I feel like if I would have had that, if I would have known who I was and known that I mattered and that I wasn't to blame, then I may have had the bravery, the courage, I don't know, the courage. I would have been able to be like, no, it's not my fault. I don't make you do this. This is something you do and not me. I think teachings on domestic violence need to start at a much younger age. Yeah, I kind of think that's all I have. I don't know. Does anyone have any questions for me?
Aaron, I'll ask a question. You did mention, you don't think if anybody had, you weren't willing to accept the help that was offered. I don't want to say discouraging, it's a little discouraging for those of us who would like to be help to people. What, if anything, was helpful to you, do you think, in helping you move out of those relationships?
Okay, I guess kind of a clarifier, like if somebody would have been like, oh, you need to leave him, that probably wouldn't have been like I probably wouldn't have accepted those kind of words of help.
Yeah.
In my life's experience, the antidote to disconnection is connection and non-judgmental, like love.
Yeah.
That I love you, even if I don't agree with the choices you're making, even if I don't agree with the situation you're in, I love you and I'm here to support you, and I'm not going to judge the choices that you make, but I want to tell you, you deserve more.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Did you get that support from your parents? How involved were they?
Well, I make a joke that my family sucks and it's okay. I love them in spite of it because I don't expect any different. Up until about 16, my family was as involved as they could be. My mother worked a lot. Her and my stepdad worked different shifts. So like when my mom was home, he was at work. When he was at work, my mom was home, but she worked midnights, and so she slept a lot. And it's not that they were bad parents. They were just always working and kind of oblivious to what was really going on. And then I started kind of isolating from them. And so they didn't really know what was going on until it was too late, if that makes sense.
Aaron?
Yes.
How old were you and what made you turn your life around?
Well, I'm 37 now. So I was 32 years old and I had got involved in a lifestyle of addiction and human trafficking, and a situation occurred that led me to prison. And it was while I was in county jail waiting to get sentenced. I opened the Bible and I forget the exact verse, but it was like, a man who confesses his sins will be saved. And I had known Jesus and I had had encounters with him and I knew he was real. I just consistently was running away. And it was like at that point, like he spoke to my heart, like, you're here for a reason. I didn't let you die along the way for a reason. And something just told me that if I didn't change my life, that I wasn't going to make it out alive. And so while I was in prison, I took advantage of every opportunity to learn a new lifestyle, to learn something new. I took countless groups. I did a cognitive behavioral therapy 15-month program. I probably completed 3 different rounds of the domestic violence training put on by the Domestic Violence Network. And I came home and I just made completely different choices. I relocated to Franklin County, went to Rachel's house, which is ministry through Lower Lights church over on the west side of Columbus. And I've just done everything different than I ever have in my life.
Good for you. Good for you.
Thank you.
Good for you.
Aaron, this is Janie. I want to thank you for sharing your story to all of us. And it really is, I'm just so thankful for you that you have made a change in your life and are reaching out to help others.
Thank you so much.
Is
Thank
that
you.
what you think you want to do with your social work degree? has helped domestic violence survivors?
Not just domestic violence. My life story was a complex cycle of violence, drug addiction, and abuse. And I don't want to limit myself to just one of those aspects. I don't exactly know 100% what I want to be when I grow up. I just know I want to help people. And once upon a time, I used to think I wanted to help women, but it's not. I've learned in my work at Sanctuary Night, it's not just the women that need help. And over the years, I kind of developed this man hatred in my head, but not all men are bad men. And so I just want to help people because people are hurting and people deserve love, and love is what saved me. So I just want to love in whatever aspect that winds up looking like.
Dream God's dream. Holy Spirit, help us dream of a world where there is justice and where everyone is free to build and grow and love and to simply have enough. The world will change when we dream God's dream. I'm dreaming of a world where the color of one's skin will mean less than what's within that person's heart. A world where water's clean and where air is safe to breathe, and every child born has enough to eat. Dream God's dream. Holy Spirit, help us dream of a world where there is justice and where everyone is free to build and grow and love and to simply have enough. The world will change when we dream God's dream. I'm dreaming of the call God is offering to me, how to use my energy and my best gifts to do the work of Christ, to say, God, please use my life to spread your healing love and to live your truth. Dream God's dream. Holy Spirit, help us dream of a world where there is justice and where everyone is free to build and grow and love and to simply have enough. The world will change when we dream God's dream. I'm dreaming of the way that I want my life to go. I've got hopes and I've got goals I'd like to meet, and I'm gonna reach high for the stars, but I won't forget the scars of Christ who died to show that the dream's for all. Dream God's dream. Holy Spirit, help us dream of a world where there is justice and where everyone is free to build and grow and love and to simply have enough. The world will change when we dream.